Hi, good to see you. Have a seat. Yeah. Good.
Professor Noam Chomsky, in your, if I'm not mistaken, first TV media appearance for Serbian media. Thank you very much for being with us. Last month marked the 7th anniversary of the beginning of the bombing of Yugoslavia. Why did NATO wage that war? Or I should say, why did the United States wage that war?
Well, actually, we have, for the first time, a very authoritative comment on that from the highest level of the Clinton administration, which is something that one could have surmised before, but now it is asserted. This is from Stroh Talbot, who was in charge of the, he ran the Pentagon State Department Intelligence Joint Committee on the diplomacy during the whole affair, including the bombing. So that's very top of the Clinton administration. He just wrote the foreword to a book by his director of communications, John Norris. And in the foreword he says, if you really want to understand what the thinking was in the top of the Clinton administration, this is the book you should read. And you'll take a look at John Norris's book, and what he says is the real purpose of the war had nothing to do with concern for Kosovo Albanians. It was because Serbia was not carrying out the required social and economic reforms, meaning it was the last corner of Europe which had not subordinated itself to the U.S.-run neoliberal programs, so therefore had to be eliminated. That's from the highest level. Again, you could have guessed it, but I've never seen it said before. I mean, that it wasn't because of the Kosovo Albanians, that we know. There is just, I mean, this is a point of religious fanaticism in the West. Can't talk about it for interesting reasons having to do with Western culture. But there is just overwhelming documentation of impeccable documentation, two big compilations of the State Department trying to justify the war, the OSCE records, NATO records, the KVM Monitor records, long British parliamentary inquiry which went into it. They all show the same thing. I mean, sort of what we knew. I mean, it was an ugly place. There were atrocities.
But given this clear documentary record, I want to ask you about the elite intellectual opinion, what you call, in the United States,
and the West,
because it was, and in the West in general, because
that's for different
reviewing it, you would get the impression, you would be forgiven for imagining that every critic of the NATO intervention was one of two things: either a Milosevic sympathizer or someone who doesn't care about genocide. What does this mean?
Well, first of all, that's a common feature of intellectual culture. One good U.S. critic, Harold Rosenberg, once described intellectuals as the herd of independent minds. They think they're very independent, but they're stampede in a herd, which is true. When there's a party line, you have to adhere to it. And the party line is systematic. The party line is subordination to state power and to state violence. Now, you're allowed to criticize it, but on very narrow grounds. You can criticize it because it's not working, or it's a mistake, or benign intentions that went astray, or something. In fact, you see it right now in the Iraq War. There's a ton of debate about the Iraq War, but take a look at it. It's very similar to the debate in Pravda during the invasion of Afghanistan. Actually, I brought this up to a Polish reporter recently and asked him if he'd been reading Pravda. He just laughed. He said, yeah, it's the same. Now, you read Pravda in the 1980s, it's the travail of the Russian soldiers, too many are getting killed, these terrorists who prevent us from bringing justice and peace to the Afghans. We of course didn't invade, we intervened in order to try to help them at the request of the legitimate government, and the terrorists are preventing us from doing all the things we want to do. I've read Japanese counterinsurgency documents from the Second World War, from the 1930s. Same, we're trying to bring them an earthly paradise, but the Chinese bandits are preventing it. In fact, I don't know of an exception in history. You go back to British imperialism, it's the same. I mean, even people of the highest moral integrity, like John Stuart Mill, were talking about, well, we have to intervene in India and conquer India because the barbarians can't control themselves. They commit atrocities to bring them the benefits of British rule and civilization and so on. Now, in the United States, the same. Now, take the bombing of Kosovo. That was a critically important event for American intellectuals. And the reason had to do with what was going on during the 90s. The 90s are, for the West, not just the U.S., France and England are worse. It's probably the low point in intellectual history for the West, I think. I mean, it was like a comic strip mimicking a satire of Stalinism, literally. You take a look at the New York Times and the French press, the British press. It was all full of talk about how there's a normative revolution that has swept to the West. For the first time in history, a state, namely the United States, the leader of the free world, is acting from pure altruism. Clinton's policy has entered into a noble phase with a saintly glow. On and on. I'm quoting from the liberals.
Now, this particular humanitarian charade.
That's pre-Kosovo.
Right. And it was specific in a sense because it was based on the claim that it was preventing genocide. Let me just read something that you said in an interview around the time of the bombing. You said, "The term genocide, as applied to Kosovo, is an insult to the victims of Hitler. In fact, it's revisionist to an extreme." What did you mean by that?
First of all, let me just fix the timing. Right. The things I've been quoting are from the late 90s.
Before Kosovo.
Yep. Now, they needed some event to justify this massive self-adulation. Okay? Along came Kosovo, fortunately. All right, so now we have to stop genocide. What was the genocide in Kosovo? We know from the Western documentation what it was. In the year prior to the bombing, according to just the Western sources, about 2,000 people were killed. Killings were distributed. A lot of them were coming, in fact, according to the British government, which was the most hawkish element of the alliance, up until January 1999, the majority of the killings were by the KLA guerrillas, who were coming in, as they said, to try to incite a harsh Serbian response, which they got, in order to appeal to Western humanitarians to bomb. Well, we know from the Western records that nothing changed between January and March. In fact, up until March 20th, they indicate nothing. March 20th, they indicate an increase in KLA attacks. But it was ugly, but by international standards, I mean, almost invisible, unfortunately. And it was very distributed. If the British are correct, the majority was coming from KLA guerrillas.
And as it later turned out, the KLA was also receiving financial and military support.
They were being supported by the CIA nearly in those months. Okay, so that's not to call that genocide. Is really to insult the victims of the Holocaust. The Western intellectuals were praising themselves for their magnificent humanitarianism, and much worse atrocities were going on right across the border in Turkey. That's inside NATO, not at the borders of NATO. They were saying, how can we allow this at the borders of NATO? Yeah. How about inside NATO, where Turkey was had driven probably several million Kurds out of their homes, destroyed about 3,500 villages, laid waste to the whole place, every conceivable form of torture and massacre that you can imagine, killed nobody knows how many people, we don't count our victims, tens of thousands of people. How were they able to do it? The reason is because they were getting 80% of their arms from Clinton. And as the atrocities increased, the arms flow increased. In fact, in one single year, 1997, Clinton sent more arms to Turkey than the entire Cold War period combined up until the counterinsurgency. That was not reported in the West. You do not report your own crimes. That's critical. And in the midst of all of this, how can we tolerate a couple of thousand people being killed in Kosovo, mixed guerrillas? And, in fact, the 50th anniversary of NATO took place right in the middle of this.
In the middle of the moment.
And there were lamentations about what's going on right across NATO's border. Not a word about the much worse things going on inside NATO's border, thanks to the massive flow of arms from the United States. And that's only one case. Comparable things were going on all over, with the U.S. and Britain supporting them. Much worse. But this, you had to focus on this. That was the topic for the herd of independent minds, played a crucial role in their self-image, because they had been going through a period of praising themselves for their magnificence in their normative revolution and the noble phase and so on and so forth. So the godsend. And therefore you couldn't ask any questions about it. Incidentally, the same happened in the earlier phase of the Balkan Wars. So they're awful and so on and so forth. However, but if you look at the coverage, for example, there was one famous incident which just completely reshaped Western opinion. That was the photograph of the thin man in the behind the barbed wire. Well, you remember the thin man behind the barbed wire. So that was Auschwitz, and we can't have Auschwitz again. So the intellectuals went crazy. French were posturing on television and the usual antics. Well, it was investigated, and carefully investigated. In fact, it was investigated by the leading Western specialist on the topic, Philip Knightley. He's a highly respected media analyst, and his specialty is photojournalism. Is probably the most famous Western and most respected Western analyst of this. He did a detailed analysis of it, and he determined that it was probably the reporters who were behind the barbed wire. And the place was ugly, but it was a refugee camp. People could leave if they wanted. Right near the thin man, there was a fat man, and so on. Well, there was one tiny newspaper in England, probably 3 people, called LM, which ran a critique of this. The British, who haven't the slightest concept of freedom of speech, that is total fraud. A major corporation, ITN, big media corporation, had publicized these. So the corporation sued the tiny newspaper for libel. Well, British libel laws are absolutely atrocious. A person who's accused has to prove that what he's reporting was done with malice. You can't prove that. So, and in fact, when you have a huge corporation with batteries of lawyers and so on, carrying out a suit against 3 people in an office who probably don't have pocket money, it's obvious what's going to happen, especially under these grotesque libel laws. So yes, they were able to prove, the little newspaper couldn't prove that it was done with malice, put out of business. There was just euphoria in the left liberal British press. After they put the newspaper out of business under this utterly grotesque legal case in British laws, the left liberal newspapers, like The Guardian, and were just in a state of euphoria about this wonderful achievement. They had managed to destroy a tiny newspaper because it questioned some image that they had presented, and they were very proud of themselves for, which was probably misunderstood or misinterpreted. Well, Philip Knightley wrote a very harsh critique of the British media for behaving in this way and tried to teach them an elementary lesson about freedom of speech. He also added that probably the photograph was misinterpreted. Couldn't get published. Well, that's when Kosovo came along, it's the same thing. That you cannot tell the truth about it. In fact, I've gone through a ton of reporting on this. Almost invariably, they invert the chronology. There were atrocities. The fact is they were after the bombing. The way it's presented is the atrocities took place and then we had the bomb to prevent genocide. Just invert it.
Let me ask you about the conduct of the actual war. And you mentioned The Guardian. It's interesting because you yourself recently had an unpleasant experience where The Guardian misquoted you over Srebrenica, misquoted you to make it appear as if you were questioning the Srebrenica massacre. But let me bring you back to the conduct of the actual war, because that was another...
The 1999
the bombing, which was also overlooked or selectively covered by Western media in general. Now, Amnesty International, among others, reported that, quote, NATO committed serious violations of the rules of war during its campaign. Numerous human rights groups concur and document various war crimes. One of them had its anniversary 2 days ago when the radio television of Serbia was bombed, the national television, its headquarters, killing 16 people. First of all, why were these crimes completely unreported? And secondly, you already touched on that. And secondly, is there any prospect for there being any responsibility taken for these crimes?
Well, actually, the crimes were reported, but they were cheered. It's not that they were unknown. Like the bombing of the radio station, yeah, it was reported, a TV station. But that's fine, because the TV station was described as a propaganda outlet, so therefore we had the right to bomb it. That happens all the time. It just happened last year, in November 2004. One of the worst war crimes in Iraq was the invasion of Fallujah. That's one thing, the bombing. There's something worse. The invasion of Fallujah actually was kind of similar to Srebrenica, if you look. But they invaded Fallujah. The first thing that the invading troops did, U.S. troops, was to take over the general hospital and throw the patients on the floor. They'd taken out their beds, put on their floor, hands tied behind their backs. And doctors thrown on the floor, hands behind their backs. There was a picture of it in the front page of the New York Times. They said it was wonderful.
And the Geneva Convention forbids hospitals
to... It's a grave breach of the Geneva Convention. George Bush should be facing the death penalty for that, even under U.S. law. But it was presented, no mention of the Geneva Conventions, and it was presented as a wonderful thing because the Fallujah General Hospital was a propaganda center, namely it was releasing casualty figures. Okay? So therefore it was correct to carry out a massive war crime. Well, the bombing of the TV station was presented the same way. In fact, as I'm sure you recall, there was an offer from NATO that they wouldn't bomb it if they agreed to run, I think, 6 hours of NATO propaganda. Well, this is considered quite right. How can it be dealt with? A group of international lawyers did appeal to the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia. They presented a brief saying they should look into NATO war crimes. What they cited was reports from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, admissions by the NATO command. That was what they presented. I forget, I think this was Della Ponte at the time, said that she would not look at it in violation of the laws of the tribunal because she had faith in NATO. That was the answer. Well, something else interesting happened after that. Yugoslavia did bring a case to the World Court.
Which also rejected it.
The court accepted it. In fact, I deliberated it for a couple of years. It may still be. But what is interesting is that the U.S. excused itself from the case, and the court accepted the excuse. Why? Because Yugoslavia had mentioned the Genocide Convention. And the U.S. did sign the Genocide Convention after 40 years. It ratified it. But it ratified it with a reservation, saying inapplicable to the United States. So in other words, the United States is entitled to commit genocide. Therefore, and that was the case that the U.S. Justice Department, Clinton's, brought to the World Court. And the court had to agree. If a country does not accept World Court jurisdiction, they have to be excluded. So the U.S. was excluded from the trial on the grounds that it grants itself the right to commit genocide. Do you think this was reported here?
The World Court, though, excused itself from hearing the case, trying the illegality of the war on the grounds that Yugoslavia was not a full member of the United Nations at the time when the case was
I know
brought?
the case when maybe they finally reached that judgment. For several years they were deliberating it. But, and that's the sequence. Does any of this get reported? No. You can ask your friends at Princeton. In fact, ask the faculty. They don't know. I mean, these, any more than they will know that, I mean, they sort of probably remember the bombing, the capture of the General Hospital at Fallujah, but was there one comment anywhere saying there's a war crime?
What struck me was that you compared the Srebrenica massacre with the Fallujah invasion. Why is that comparison?
Similarity. And in the case of Srebrenica, the women and children were trucked out, and then came, the massacre. In the case of Fallujah, the women and children were ordered out. They weren't trucked out. They were ordered out, but the men weren't allowed to leave. And then came the attack. In fact, it turned out that the roads out were blocked. Well, I mean, the whole thing isn't, it's not the same story, but that part is similar. I actually mentioned that a couple of times. Storm of protest, hysteria, Incidentally, this Guardian affair, part of it, which was total fraud, on the part of the editors, not the reporter. They blamed it on the reporter, but it was the editors. One of the things that they were infuriated about was that she asked me, what about the thin man and the behind the barbed wire? Isn't that a horrible atrocity? And I said, well, it's not certain that it was correct. Okay, that led to a hysteria. That's when Philip Knightley tried to intervene, to present once again his analysis and once again his critique of the media, but couldn't. And he's a very prominent, prestigious person. You just cannot break ranks. That's not tolerated. I mean, we're lucky. We don't have censorship. It's a free society. But the self-censorship is overwhelming. Actually, Orwell once wrote about this in something that nobody's read. Everyone has read Animal Farm. Well, almost nobody's read the introduction to Animal Farm.
Unpublished.
Unpublished. Came out as unpublished papers 30 years later. In it, what he said is Animal Farm's a satire of this totalitarian state. He said free England is not very different. In free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. He gave some examples. It's very similar here. And it doesn't matter how extreme they are. I mean, the Iraq invasion is a perfect example. There is not, you cannot find anywhere in the mainstream a suggestion that it's wrong to invade another country. That if you invade another country, you have to pay reparations, you have to withdraw, and the leadership has to be punished. I mean, I don't know if you ever read the Nuremberg judgments, but after the Nuremberg judgments, Justice Jackson, the chief of counsel for the prosecution, U.S. Justice, made a very, very eloquent statement about how we're sentencing these people to death. The crimes for which they committed are crimes when anybody commits them, including when we commit them. And we have to live up to that. He said, we are handing the defendants a poisoned chalice. And if we sip from this poisoned chalice, we must be treated the same way. Can't be more explicit. They also defined aggression. Aggression was defined in terms which just apply absolutely and without exception, not only to the invasion of Iraq, but to all sorts of other invasions in Vietnam and many others. Actually, even the terrorist war against Nicaragua technically falls under the crime of aggression as defined at Nuremberg.
Does the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia?
And that's not even questioned. In fact, there was a so-called independent commission of inquiry on the Kosovo bombing led by a very respected South African jurist, Justice Goldstone, and they concluded that the bombing was, in their words, illegal but legitimate. Okay, illegal makes it a war crime. But they said it was legitimate because it was necessary to stop genocide. And then comes the usual inversion of the history. Actually, Justice Goldstone, who is a respectable person, later recognized that the atrocities came after the bombing. And that they were furthermore the anticipated consequence of the bombing. He did recognize that in a lecture, Morgenthau lecture in New York a couple of years ago. He said, well, nevertheless, we can take some comfort in the fact that Serbia was planning it anyway. And the proof that they were planning it is, guess what? Operation Horseshoe. A probable intelligence fabrication that was publicized after the bombing. So even if it was true, it wouldn't matter. And furthermore, even if it was true, it was a contingency plan. I mean, look, Israel has contingency plans to drive all the Palestinians out of the West Bank if there's a conflict. Does that mean that Iran has a right to bomb Israel? The U.S. has contingency plans to invade Canada. Okay, does that mean everybody has a right to bomb the United States? I mean, that's the last straw of justification on the part of a respectable person. But for the herd of independent minds, it just doesn't matter. The bombing was because of our high values and our nobility, and it was to stop genocide. If you say anything else, the torrent of vilification and abuse comes. But it's not just on this issue. It's on every issue. So try to bring up the idea. Take, say, the Vietnam War. A lot of time has passed. A huge amount of scholarship, tons of documentation, blew up the country.
Let me just, I'm sorry, we won't have time for going into that. I want to ask you about some of the present developments that are being used again to fabricate a lot of these issues. Slobodan Milosevic died last month. What is the significance of his death in your view?
Milosevic was committed many crimes. Not a nice person, terrible person. But the charges against him would never have held up. He was originally indicted on the Kosovo charges. The indictment was issued right in the middle of the bombing, which already nullifies it. They admittedly used British and U.S. intelligence. This is right in the middle of the bombing. Can't possibly take seriously. However, if you look at the indictment, it was for crimes committed after the bombing. There's one exception, Vracek. Well, let's even grant that the claims are true. Let's put it aside. All right, so there was one exception, no evidence that he was involved, or no evidence that he was involved, or what took place. But almost the entire indictment was for after the bombing. How are those charges going to stand up unless you put Bill Clinton and Tony Blair on the dock alongside him? Then they realized that was a weak case, so they added the early Balkan Wars. Okay. A lot of horrible things happened. But the worst crime, the one that they're really going to charge him with genocide, is Srebrenica. There's a little problem with that. Namely, there was an extensive, detailed inquiry into it by the Dutch government, which was the responsible government. There were Dutch forces there. And that's a big, hundreds of pages of inquiry. Their conclusion is that Milosevic didn't know anything about it, and that when it was discovered in Belgrade, they were horrified. Well, suppose that had entered into testimony.
Does this mean that you were a Milosevic sympathizer?
No, I thought it was terrible. I thought he should have been thrown out. In fact, he probably would have been thrown out in the early 90s if the Albanians had voted. It was pretty close. Yeah, he did all sorts of terrible things, but it wasn't a totalitarian state. There were elections, there was an opposition, a lot of rotten things everywhere. And I certainly wouldn't want to have dinner with him or talk to him. And yes, he deserves to be tried for crimes, but this trial was never going to hold up if it was even semi-honest. It was a farce. In fact, they were lucky that he died.
In what sense?
Because they didn't have to go through with the trial. Now you can build up an image about how he would have been convicted as another Hitler, and we don't have to do it.
I just want to bring you back to the bombing of RTS. Some have argued that this particular act of NATO in '99 set precedents for targeting of media by the United States afterward, notably in Afghanistan and Iraq. That is, that it set a precedent for legitimizing media houses and labeling them as propaganda in order to bomb them in U.S. invasions. Do you make any connection there?
Well, the chronology is correct, but I don't think they need excuses. The point is, you bomb anybody you want to. Let's take 1998, so it's before it. In 1998, here's another thing you're not allowed to say in the United States or the West. It leads to hysteria, but I'll say it. In 1998, Clinton bombed the major pharmaceutical plant in the Sudan. Okay, this is the plant that's producing most of the pharmaceuticals and veterinary medicines for a poor African country that's under embargo, can't replace them. What's that going to do? It's obviously going to kill unknown numbers of people. In fact, the U.S. barred an investigation by the UN, so we don't know. And of course, you don't investigate your own crimes. But there's some evidence. So the German ambassador, who was a fellow at Harvard University to Sudan, wrote an article in the Harvard International Review in which he estimated the casualties in the tens of thousands of deaths. The head of the Near East Foundation, very respectable foundation, the regional director at fieldwork in Somalia, in Sudan, he did a study. He came out with the same conclusion, probably tens of thousands dead. Right after the bombing, within weeks, Human Rights Watch issued a warning that there's going to be a humanitarian catastrophe and gave examples of aid workers being pulled out from areas where people were dying at a vast rate and so on. You cannot mention this. Any mention of this brings the same hysteria as criticizing the bombing of the TV station. It's unmentionable. It's a Western crime, and therefore it was legitimate. We're not, I mean, just suppose that Al-Qaeda blew up half the pharmaceutical supplies in the U.S. or England or Israel or any country in which people lived, human beings, not ants, people. I mean, can you imagine the reaction? We'd probably have a nuclear war. But when we do it to a poor African country, it didn't happen. Not discussed. In fact, the only issue that is discussed, there is discussion, is whether the intelligence was correct when it claimed that it was also producing chemical weapons. That is the only question. Mention anything else, the usual hysteria and tirades. This is a very disciplined, Western intellectual culture is extremely disciplined and rigid. You cannot go beyond fixed bounds. It's not, it's not censored. It's all voluntary. But it's true. It's not, incidentally, not every society is like this. In fact, the third world countries are different. So take, say, Turkey, half third world. I mean, Turkey, the intellectuals, the leading intellectuals, best known writers, academics, journalists, artists, I mean, they not only protest atrocities like the Kurdish massacres, they protest them constantly, but they're also constantly carrying out civil disobedience against them. Which I've participated with them sometimes. They will publish banned writings which report it, present them to the prosecutor's office, demand to be prosecuted. That's not a joke. Facing, sometimes they are sent to prison. That's no joke. There's nothing like that in the West. Inconceivable. When I'm in Western Europe and I hear them telling me Turkey isn't civilized enough to enter the European Union, I burst out laughing. It's the other way around.
You mentioned the democratic movements in various countries. There was, of course, a promising democratic movement in Serbia before and, of course, during the bombing. And people like Wesley Clark had claimed that this bombing would be of benefit to the anti-Milosevic forces when, of course, it turned out to be a disaster. Was this a sincere evaluation on behalf of NATO?
I can't look into their minds. I mean, when you commit a crime, it is extremely easy to find a justification for it. That's true of personal life. It's true of international affairs. So yeah, maybe they believed it. I mean, I think there's convincing evidence that the Japanese fascists believed that they were doing good when they carried out this magnificent work. John Stuart Mill surely believed he was being honorable and noble when he was calling for the conquest of India right after some of the worst atrocities, which he didn't mention. Yeah, you can easily believe you're noble. I mean, to me, it seemed obvious it was going to harm the democratic movement. I wrote about it, and I couldn't get much information, but it's obvious that that's going to happen. It's happening right now in Iran. I mean, there's a democratic movement in Iran. They're pleading with the United States not to maintain a harsh embargo, certainly not to attack. It's harming them. It strengthens the most reactionary, violent elements in the society, of course.
Let me ask you one final question about the future. Negotiations over Kosovo's final status are underway right now. The United States is backing Agim Čeku, who was someone involved in ethnic cleansing, not only...
He was a war criminal himself. What about the Krafina expulsion, which he was...
Now, first of all, what do you see as an appropriate, realistic solution to the final status of Kosovo, and how does it differ from what the United States is now promoting?
Well, my feeling has been for a long time that the only realistic solution is one which in fact was offered by the president of Serbia, I think, back around 1993, namely some kind of partition with the Serbian, by now there's very few Serbs left, but what were the Serbian areas being part of Serbia, the rest being what they call independent, which means it was in Albania. I just don't see any other, I didn't see any other feasible solution 10 years ago, and I still don't see any other one.
Shall we wrap up? Mr. Chomsky, thank you very much.